There's a jar of urine sitting in David Bowie's fridge, not by accident, not because something went wrong. This was a choice. A deliberate, intentional, thought-out decision made by one of the greatest musicians who ever lived. And the reason, the actual documented reason, is that Bowie was convinced that Jimmy Page and a satanic coven were plotting to steal his bodily fluids and use them to bring the Antichrist into the world. I'm not making this up. I genuinely wish I were. To understand how we got to the urine in the fridge situation, you have to understand where David Bowie's head was at in 1975. And the answer is, somewhere very, very far from planet Earth, and not in the glamorous Ziggy Stardust way. By this point, Bowie had already shapeshifted through more identities than most people have hot dinners. He'd been Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, and was in the process of becoming the Thin White Duke. He was living in Los Angeles. He was doing an absolutely industrial amount of cocaine. And when I say industrial, I mean the man has since admitted he has almost no memory of recording Station to Station, one of his finest albums, because he was so deep in it. That's not a cautionary tale, and that's a geological event. But cocaine wasn't the only thing consuming him. Bowie had always been fascinated with the occult. This wasn't some passing phase or rock star affectation. It went deep. His half-brother, Terry Burns, had introduced him to the world of esotericism when Bowie was young, and it stayed with him. The mystical, the hidden, the forbidden. It was all tangled up in who Bowie was. The personas, the alter egos, the sense that identity itself was a kind of magic trick. All of it fed into the same obsession. So you've got a genius who's running on no sleep, enormous quantities of cocaine, a crumbling sense of self, and a lifelong fixation on occult forces. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Well, both of that is.
All of these. You'll buy that?
I glit from one thing to another a lot.
Glit.
It's like flit, but it's the 70s version.
One letter later in the alphabet.
If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the madness that was 1970s rock, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. And while you're at it, drop a like on the video. It tells the algorithm we exist. And honestly, at this point, the algorithm is more mysterious than anything Aleister Crowley ever cooked up. Let's go back to the story.
But I'm hoping to kick this light that is glowing.
So, here's where it gets interesting, because Bowie wasn't the only rock titan in this particular corner of the darkness. Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, guitar god, riff architect, the man responsible for some of the most earth-shattering music ever put to tape. Also, a man with a very well-documented and very serious interest in the occult. We're talking owned Aleister Crowley's actual house levels of commitment here. Volskin House, up in Scotland. The property where Crowley himself had lived and practiced. Page didn't just dabble. He collected Crowley artifacts, studied the texts, ran an occult bookshop. This wasn't a vibe. This was a whole lifestyle. So when Bowie and Page found themselves in each other's orbit, they had plenty to talk about. And they'd known each other for a long time, longer than most people realize. The friendship actually goes back to 1965, when Page was still doing session work. Bowie's band at the time, the Manish Boys, brought in the young guitarist to play on their cover of I Pity the Fool. These two were connected before either of them was a household name. Before Ziggy, before Zeppelin, before any of it. Through the late 60s and into the 70s, as both men became colossal, they stayed in each other's world. Two British rock legends, both obsessed with the occult, both operating at the absolute peak of their powers. They were, for a while, genuinely friendly. The kind of friendship that probably looked electric from the outside. Two of rock's most mysterious figures, circling the same dark ideas. But by 1975, something had curdled.
Take a look at the low man, beating up the wrong guy. Oh man.
One evening in February 1975, Page came over to Bowie's Manhattan apartment. Bowie's girlfriend at the time, Ava Cherry, was also there. By all accounts, the atmosphere was already strained before anyone sat down. Bowie's paranoia was running hot. His relationship with reality was fraying at the edges, and having Jimmy Page in his home was not exactly a relaxing proposition. Think about the energy in that room for a second. Two men who had been friendly for a decade, two men who knew each other's obsessions inside out, two men who at this point in their lives were both operating in territory where the line between rockstar mythology and genuine belief had become dangerously thin. The tension wasn't just personal, it was metaphysical. Or at least that's how both of them appeared to be experiencing it. And then, Page spilled wine on Bowie's silk cushions. Now, fine. Accidents happen. Wine gets spilled. But here's where it turns. Instead of owning it, Page apparently tried to blame Ava Cherry. Just pointed the finger straight at her and let it hang there. For Bowie, that was it. The whole evening, already stretched thin with tension and cocaine and occult energy, snapped. He told Page to leave. And not through the door either. The exact reported line is Bowie telling him, "Why don't you take the window?" Which is a magnificent thing to say to someone on an upper floor of a Manhattan building. And I would like it on my gravestone, personally. But this wasn't just two blokes having a row about soft furnishings. According to Paul Trinka's biography, Starman, what happened in that room went far beyond a social falling out. As the two men faced each other, according to Ava Cherry, Page seemed to be actively invoking dark forces against Bowie. And Bowie, instead of laughing it off or calling a cab, met it head on. He wanted to prove his will was stronger. Think about that for a second. Two of the biggest names in rock staring each other down in a New York apartment, both apparently trying to out-occult the other. This is not how most people end their evenings.
Gets dead. There's something wrong. Can you hear me? Bite your tongue.
After that night, something broke loose in Bowie's mind that didn't go back together for a while. He became convinced, genuinely totally convinced, that Jimmy Page and a satanic coven were after him. Not metaphorically, not as a creative concept, literally after him. And specifically, they were after his bodily fluids. The belief, as far as it can be reconstructed, was rooted in occult ideas about using someone's physical essence to perform rituals against them. In Bowie's cocaine-scorched, occult-saturated brain, this became a very real and very urgent threat. And so he did what any reasonable person would do. He started storing his urine in his fridge. Yes, his own urine in jars in the refrigerator, where you keep your milk and your leftovers. The idea was that by keeping it physically secured, he was preventing Page and his alleged coven from getting hold of it and using it in whatever Antichrist summoning ritual he'd convinced himself they were planning. This is documented. This is not rumor. Bowie himself, in later years, looked back at this period with a kind of horrified amazement at what he'd put himself through. He described this era as one of the darkest and most frightening of his life. And this is a man who once decided to become an alien rock star as a coping mechanism, so the bar for dark and frightening was set fairly high.
Freak out in a moon-age daydream. Oh yeah.
Now, here's the thing. It's very easy to just play this for laughs. And look, there is an inherent comedy to the image of David Bowie rearranging his refrigerator to make room for a jar of his own pee. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but there's something genuinely sad underneath it too. Bowie in 1975 was not okay. The cocaine had taken hold of him in a way that was doing real damage to his body, yes, but also to his sense of what was real. He was eating almost nothing. He was sleeping barely at all. He was, by his own later account, running on pepper, milk, and cocaine. The alien, thin, electric-eyed figure you see in photos from this era looks iconic. And underneath it was a man who was genuinely terrified, genuinely struggling, and genuinely not sure where reality ended and the darkness began. The occult obsession, which had always been a creative spark for him, had fused with the paranoia and the drugs and turned into something much more frightening. The line between fascination and delusion had dissolved entirely. What makes it all the more haunting is that this was the same mind that had conjured Ziggy Stardust, that had turned alienation and strangeness into something millions of people felt understood by. The same imagination that made him extraordinary also made him uniquely vulnerable to this kind of spiral. There was no off switch. When the darkness got in, it got into everything. And Jimmy Page, whether through genuine occult rivalry, a spilled glass of wine, or just being the wrong person in the wrong room on the wrong night, had become the face of everything Bowie was afraid of.
Strung out in heaven's high, hitting an all-time.
The friendship between Bowie and Page never really recovered. These two men who had known each other since they were young, who had shared an obsession that set them apart from almost everyone else in rock, drifted apart after that February night and never quite found their way back. Bowie eventually pulled himself out of the Los Angeles abyss. He moved to Berlin. He made Low, Heroes Lodger, the Berlin Trilogy, some of the most innovative and emotionally raw music of his career. He got cleaner. He got steadier. He looked back at the thin white Duke years, the way you look back at a near miss on a motorway. Shaken, relieved, not entirely sure how you got through it. Page, meanwhile, kept going with Zeppelin until Bonham's death in 1980 ended the band. His interest in the occult never really faded. Boleskine House remained in his possession for years. Two men, two paths through the same darkness, and only one of them found a way out to the other side. The urine, as far as history records, was eventually removed from the fridge. Whether it was disposed of properly, or whether some coven got hold of it after all, the records do not say. The Antichrist, as far as we can tell, was not successfully born, so presumably the system worked.
We could be heroes just for one day.
And that, my friends, is the story of David Bowie, Jimmy Page, a silk cushion, a Manhattan apartment, and the most extraordinary home storage decision in rock history. The 1970s really were something else. You could be the most talented, charismatic, visionary artist on the planet, and also, simultaneously, be convincing yourself that the guitarist from Led Zeppelin was sending witches after your Wii. These things were not mutually exclusive. The era contained multitudes. There are more stories like this one, so many more. The 1970s were absolutely riddled with genius, chaos, paranoia, and people making deeply questionable decisions in the name of rock and roll. Stick around. We're going to get through all of them together. And remember, don't let anyone near your fridge.
'Cause we're lovers, and that is the fact.
But I'm hoping to kick, but this light it is glowing.
Take a look at the low man, beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, gets dead. There's something wrong. Can you hear me? Night your tongue. A freak out in a moon-age daydream. Oh yeah.
Strung out